So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them. People ran there by land from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. So as he stepped ashore, he saw a huge crowd and had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. But it was already late. His disciples approached him and said, "This place is a wilderness, and it is already late. Send them away so they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat." "You give them something to eat," he responded. And they said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in the ranks of hundreds and fifties. Then he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looked up into heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves. He kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them. Everyone ate and was filled. Then they packed up 12 basketfuls of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. May the Lord bless his reading of his word this morning. I'm going to be talking to you about the topic, little is much, this morning. And we've read about this young lad who had 5 loaves and 2 fish. And we're going to feed about 5,000 men plus others out of that. And we would say to ourselves, that's an impossibility. But with God, all things are possible. And Jesus proved that to be so. His disciples, if you would read a couple verses above where we started, had come back to report to Jesus about what they had been doing. And he says, well, we need to go to kind of a deserted place, a remote place, and rest up a little bit. You ever feel like you need to do that? Just get real busy every now and then. Our calendar, I have a calendar, Ruth has a calendar, and it seems like all of God's children have a calendar. And every now and then, I'll ask her, "You got anything happening here?" And she'll say no, and I said, "Neither do I," and we're going to circle that, and nobody's going to put anything in that hole. You know, we just need time to get away, to relax a few moments, and not have work to take place, and all those kind of things. And every now and then, it helps us to renew our minds, to relax, and get off the calendar for a few moments. And I think that's what Jesus told his disciples. We're going to depart over to a little place called Bethsaida, and we're going to rest up there a little bit. But in the process of doing that, the people see them get in the boat, and they're watching them going across the Sea of Galilee, and they take off to where that boat's going to land, which would not be uncommon because the people, they hungered. They also wanted to see people healed and the things that Jesus was doing, and they followed after them. And he looks upon that multitude when they pull into shore and says, these folks need a shepherd. They are hungry. And it was probably about 3 o'clock in the afternoon because the day was wearing on, and his disciples, they gave Jesus a couple of suggestions that we send them away while they have time to go find some food. And then another suggestion would be maybe to raise enough money to buy food, which would be been a long time since I fed 5,000 people. That's about a year's worth of salary probably to feed that many people. His disciples kind of remind me sometimes like committees. I have a definition of a committee that I got somewhere. It says a committee is a group of people who individually can do nothing and collectively decide that nothing can be done. You know, I've served on a few of those. I've served on some good committees too. Now, committees have their place and their purpose, but sometimes we can just walk around in a circle with our foot nailed down and seem to get nowhere. And it seemed that was what was happening here. But Jesus sends them into the crowd. He says, go in the crowd, see what kind of food we got here. They come back with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, I can imagine those disciples saying, oh, we're in trouble. But Jesus didn't seem to think that. He tells them to sit down in groups of 50s and 100s and decides he's going to feed them. Now, if that was going to take place in our society today, there'd be a few problems probably take place, a few obstacles. The food inspector might get after him for handling food without gloves. You know, the food, was it prepared under sanitary conditions? Was it cooked at the right temperature? Do they have a food service permit? You know, all those things. Social services might step in and arrest them for abusing a child, taking his lunch away from him. And wouldn't be any porta johns. I thought about that scenario, 5,000 people. My. And no license to assemble. That would be our society of today, and everything would have to be in order. And I thought, and not only that, they're standing out in the sunshine, there'd be those who gripe because it's too hot, you know. So I want to talk a little bit about three different points concerning this passage of Scripture and this event that has taken place. You ever notice that most sermons always have about 3 points? I'm going to do an 8-pointer one day just for the heck of it. The first thing I want to talk about is, where did the little boy get what he had to offer? And, you know, we've sung some songs about offering ourselves this morning. And this young lad, he may have caught those fish on a pole. When I was a young boy, I didn't have a reeling rod. I had a cane pole. And I'd have given anything to have a growth of bamboo like we have around here. Boy, those would make great cane poles to go fishing with. Or they may have bought those fish from a fisherman. Probably Mom prepared those fishes and loaves for this boy's lunch. And this boy probably was poor because the loaves were made out of barley. That was a poor man's flour. I ask a question here today. Where did you get what little you have? And are you willing to offer what little you have to someone else? I stand here today in front of you because there's been a time in my life where I've offered what little I had to the Lord. If you've ever walked in my shoes, if you had walked in my shoes, you would understand how intimidating it is for me to stand here in front of you today. But also how honored I am to be able to stand before you today, because there was a time in my life that I told the Lord, I don't have much to give, but what I got, I'm going to let you have it. And he has honored that over the years. We all have to realize that all that we have comes from God. I can work 1 or 2 jobs. But if God doesn't want me to work, I can't work any job. And I've had that happen in my life. One time in my life, I've only been unemployed one time. And God, I believe, did it just to show me that without me, you can't do anything. You can't even get a job. And I went about 6 weeks. Couldn't get a job. One of the most frustrating times of my life, because I believe God created men to work, and I'd always worked and felt like that I could help God out if he needed any help. But he showed me that I can't do anything if he doesn't allow me to do anything. The lunch that the little boy had was provided by God. And I think when God grew the barley, I believe God said one day when he created barley in the beginning, he said, one day I'm going to need some barley just so my son can do what he's doing here at this scenario, to show that group a miracle, how he can multiply and do those things. And the same with the fish. God created those fish. I had the privilege of eating a fish out of the Sea of Galilee when I was in Israel back in '98. The only fish I ever ate while he watched me eat him. You know, he still had his head on his eyeball looking up at me. That's an unusual experience. You know, we in America have a tendency to whack the head off of fish and chickens and stuff, but you go in other parts of the world, you eat chicken and it watches you while you eat it, you know. Leave the heads on. When we give back to God what little He has given to us, He'll still multiply it and magnify it. You know, some of the excuses we use for not giving back to God, one that came to my mind, it's not enough to make a difference. The little widow who gave the mite, it's amazing how little that was. It's ironic, though, that you and I know about her. The world knows about her. Even the secular world will talk about giving the widow's mite. You know, we might say, I don't know much. I don't have much to offer. But what little we got, if we'll give it to God, He'll do something with it. God has given every Christian at least one gift. You've got a gift. I've got a gift. Some of us may have more than one. And that gift God expects us to exercise. And I ask you this morning, are you hoarding your gift? Are you doing anything with it? Second excuse is, I'm afraid to give away what I have. Now, that's our society of today sometimes. Our American work ethic says, I need this to keep up with the Joneses. I've used that statement in my life, but you know, I never have figured out who the Joneses are. But they seem to be well off. And we seem to have them for a role model. So we say to ourselves, I'm afraid to give this away. I may need it, or I have to have it. Third excuse is, I'm not mature enough to do this. I need more years of being taught before I can do anything. Now, Satan will always tell us that. When God gets ready to use us and do something with us, Satan will always whisper in your ear, you're not qualified to do that. You don't know what you're doing. All those excuses he will give us. The fourth excuse is, somebody else will do it. That's kind of a Baptist motto kindly, that somebody else will do it. And we expect somebody else to do it. If I don't step up, somebody else will. And then lastly, and this is the best one, I like this one best because I've heard it a million times. We've never done it that way before. And I'll guarantee you, when Jesus says, go out there and see what kind of food we got, and they come back with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, they're saying to themselves, when he gets ready to feed them, we've never done that before. That's not going to work. Common sense says 5 loaves, just going to feed that little old boy and those 2 fish. I don't think those were big bass. I think they were little fellows about that big, probably. I think those loaves are not like the loaves we go over on the shelf and get at the grocery store. You know, they're about that long. I think they're probably about the size of biscuits. 5 of them for that little boy. Mama had not planned on feeding 5,000 whenever she packed that lunch. God had, though, when she packed it that morning, I'll guarantee you. Second thing I want to draw out of this is how abundant is the little that I have to offer. How big is my catch of the day? You know, little is much when God's in it. There's a song by that title. I'll share it with you in just a little bit. I'm not going to sing it, I promise you, but I will read some of it. Matthew 19:26, Jesus said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. As we see this miracle take place of him dividing the loaves and fishes, we see God at work. In the Old Testament, God gave manna to over 2 million people on a daily basis and water enough to take care of their thirst. Now, he's only going to do it for 5,000 plus one time, not every day. I ask the question, if God could do that, why can't he feed you and me? He can do that. I think back on my testimony in life. When I started getting serious about committing me to the Lord, I had a lot of things to overcome from past baggage of my life. When I was in high school, I excelled quite well in the elementary grades. But with the year I went to high school, we moved to a new location. And I had the adjustment of going to a large school like I'd never been to before, and a new school, meeting new people, new community, new way of life. You're talking about a hillbilly boy who moved to town, kind of, you know. And in that 4 years of high school, I managed to pass and get out of there, but by the skin of my teeth. And when I graduated from high school, unfortunately, they marched you down, not alphabetically, but the way you stood in the class ranking. I was number last in class ranking, but I was as happy as if I had good sense because I was graduating. And I had a couple buddies who didn't make the lineup. So I figured, well, I'm better than they are, but not much. But that stigma stayed with me for many years. And couldn't get a job. I was 16 when I got out of high school, and I went to apply for places, and they say, well, have you got your military service over with? I ain't even shaven yet, you know, and they asked me such a question. Well, the day I turned 17, I went to work on getting my military over with. I joined the Navy that day, and it took me a few weeks to get my dad to talked into signing for me. And I left almost immediately after the ink got dry. I wouldn't do that if I had that to do over because I promised to stick around for a while. Well, I did about 48 hours, but had to take a test to get in the Navy, and I thought, good grief. Just go through school, and now I'm taking a test. But you know what? It didn't dawn on me that taking that test, I scored high enough on it to not be in their quoted. They were quoting people out, and you had to score real high to even be able to get in the Navy at that time. Because military was about the only job you could get in 1958. There wasn't any jobs hardly. It's worse than it was right now. But I scored high on that test. Didn't dawn on me that I had a brain still yet. I get in the Navy. What I do? I'm taking tests every week, and I'm saying to myself, I'll never make it. I'll flunk out of boot camp. And then I got to looking around, I'd say, I know he's dumber than I am. And I figured if he can make it, I can make it. So I got through boot camp that way. And it took me quite a few years to get over the stigma of graduating last in my class. Later on, I went to college, and I did quite well in college. I didn't make the dean's list. I didn't make the honorary roll. None of those things. But I got good grades in college, and I got through college having a family of 3 and working a lot of part-time jobs because it was something I wanted to do. If I had gone to college when I got out of high school, I'd have flunked out first semester, I would have never gone back. So I thank God for what he did in my life. That gave me some encouragement, and God used that encouragement to cause me to lean forward and be willing to be used by him. And after I got out of the Navy, I went to a little church in Barstow, California. Went to work for a place, Bendix Field Engineers on a NASA project out in the deep space tracking station there at Barstow. Had a revival in that little church. God brought a revival to me. My life started changing. Ruth and I came to the place where we said, we'll go anywhere God wants us to go and do anything God wants us to do. And Satan's saying to me, well, you can't go into full-time ministry. You've not been to seminary. But I didn't care. You know, I was going to go to college. I knew that. And when I got through with college, I said, I'm not going to seminary. I've had about all that I can take. With a family, it's hard for you to do that. But it can be done because people do it all the time. I left Oregon to go back to Kentucky to go to college. While I was there, I was in a little church, and God allowed me to live through another revival. That one lasted about 2 years. It was the most exciting church I've ever been in because it was a church in revival. And I thank God for that. I left there to come to North Carolina. My first church here in North Carolina was Midwood Baptist Church, and we were there for 2 or 3 years. And Idlewild Church had a sign out in the yard up here. They were going to build a church there. I drove by it every day because I lived in Hemby Bridge, and when they got the church built, I went to one of the first services that they had that Sunday evening. And I always felt from the time that sign went up, that was the church I needed to be going to. I was drawn to that sign. And we did. We joined that church. While I was in that church, I had served in quite a few capacities there, teaching and various things and discipleship training. I became a deacon there. Our church went through a split. Right in the middle of that split, I wound up becoming chairman of deacons. Last thing in the world I would have ever dreamed would have happened to Neal Licklider. You know, you guys who've been chairman of the deacons through rough times, you understand that's not something you really want, to be chairman of the deacons, because I had some sleepless nights as a result of that. But out of that process, God blessed that church, blessed me. We had a man who came there. He was a born-again Jew. He was teaching. And I was working in insurance at that time, and I had mornings where I could be free, and he had morning sessions. I came over, and I was sitting in the room before anybody got there, and he was doing some notes on the board. And when he got done, he came back and talked to me. He said, asked me what I was doing. I told him I was selling insurance. He says, well, probably making all kinds of money. I said, well, I wouldn't bet on that, but, you know, he said, what would you like to do? I told him I was thinking about getting out of insurance. I said, I really would like to work full-time for the Lord. He said, what would you like to do? I said, well, I'd like to work maybe as minister of education, something like that. And I said, but I've not been to seminary. He said, why don't you go to work here? I said, well, we're not looking for a minister of education. I said, we're looking for a music minister. He said, why don't you ask? Yeah, that's a Jew for you, isn't it? Huh? That's the way you do it, wasn't it, Mark? Yeah. Why don't you ask? And I thought, boy, he's kind of bold. But, you know, that wouldn't leave me alone. That night, Ruth and I was having the same discussion. I was recapping what he had shared with me. And she says, well, why don't you ask? She has Jewish blood in her also. And, you know, that wouldn't leave me alone. A couple of weeks, I made an appointment with the pastor, and I went and asked. I told him, I said, you know, I know we're not looking for a minister of education, but should we ever come to that place in this church, I'd like to be considered for it. And I said, if I'm not voted in for it, I won't leave this church. I won't be mad, but I'd like to be considered for it. 6 months, I was minister of education. We still didn't have a music minister. Now, thank God they didn't ask me to lead the music, but giving God the little that I had, He used it, and I'm thankful for it. I do not have a degree from seminary. I have a degree from the Seminary of Hard Knocks. I've spent a lot of time in the Lord's Word, and I've been taught by Him, and I'm fairly knowledgeable of the Bible. What I know, I believe, and what I believe, I stand on. And I thank God in a way I didn't go to seminary, because they might have shaken my bush and I wouldn't have believed nothing when I got done. Because our seminaries here in this state at that time were not that great. But I know what I believe, and I'm thankful for it. You know, today, some of you may be dealing with a little that you've got about letting it go. Just as the widow gave the little mite that she had, you know, He took care of her. I believe He took care of her with all my heart. If we have a need, God in love gives meat for our hunger, as Jesus did as He fed all those people. This young lad will never know, probably, his abundance had he not been willing to let the Lord use it. Don't you know he had to be surprised? Can't you imagine when he got home and said, Mama, you're not going to believe what happened today. Those loaves and fishes you packed. We fed 5,000 people plus with those loaves. You should see what Jesus did. You know, when you give your little bit that you've got, you may not become a teacher. You may not become a preacher. You may not become a missionary. But I can tell you this. You will become what God already knows you can be. God knew I would be here one day, standing here. I didn't know it. But when I was willing to let him have what I've got, to go and do whatever he wanted me to do, he knew I'd be standing here one day. When Christ gets through with what you give him, there'll be plenty left over. I want you to visualize a scene. God takes 2.5 loaves and 1 fish, and he gives it to these guys over here. He says, divide that amongst those 2,500 people plus. The other 2.5 loaves and 1 fish, he gives to the disciple over here. He says, I want you to give it to all those people down through here. When everybody had eaten, he said, now I want you to go collect up the scraps. 12 basketfuls come back in. He didn't start with that much. Now they got 12 basketfuls left over. That's what happens many times. They all ate and they were all satisfied. You know, those basketfuls shows the significance of that miracle. It shows that Christ came into the world to be the great feeder as well as the great healer. These people had looked for the great healer. We like a healing show. I wish with all my heart God would answer the prayers that we have prayed for Buddy Pig, that he would heal him. I know he can. Christ not only came to restore, but to preserve and to nourish spiritual life. And in him, there's enough for all that come to him. Enough to fill the soul, enough to fill the treasures. None are sent away empty. I shared with you earlier that little is much. It's a song by that title. The Gaither group did that. It says, some of the words here says, is the harvest now ripened? There's a work for all to do. Hark, the voice of God is calling, to the harvest calling you. Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth or fame. There's a crown and you can win it if you go in Jesus' name. That's just one verse. I love that song. I love to hear that song because it's a challenge when we do it. We've talked about where did it come from and how abundant it was, and I'd like to conclude with what I will do with the little that I have to offer. How many can I feed with what God has given to me? I ask you, did you bring a lunch today? Did you bring something for the Lord to use? Do you have anything to offer? Some things that can keep us from sharing. The first thing might be, I'm ashamed of Christ. You know, when I was a young boy, sometimes, you ever get ashamed of your mom or your dad? Well, I remember as a young boy, I was ashamed of the lunch sometimes my mom would pack for me. We all had lard buckets, you know, a little bucket about that big, metal bucket with a handle on it. Lard came in those things, and we used them for lunch buckets. I wasn't ashamed of lard bucket because we all had lard buckets, you know, and that was the lunch pail. I was ashamed of the biscuit and sausage that Mom put in that lunch bucket. It was not light bread like some of the other kids had. Light bread was the uppity bread, you know. I mean, it was nice. It was like me eating barley loaves. Now I say, golly, I was rich. I pay $3 for one of those stinking biscuits now. And the sausage is not as good as Mom and Dad made, you know. I was rich, but I was ashamed of that biscuit. Sometimes we get ashamed of our Lord. We're not willing to speak up and do what he would have us to do. Sometimes the thing that might keep us from sharing is, I'm carnal. I look like the world. I act like the world. I am the world. Carnality can keep me from giving what I have to God. Third thing is that might keep me from sharing is backsliding. I've taken my life into my own hands. I want to keep my lunch for myself. Paul gives us a good life example of the lifestyle in his life. He says, I'm a debtor. You know, what if the boy didn't feel he owed these people anything? So I'm going to eat this myself. What if the boy had just come to see Jesus heal people and was blessed and went home? Paul was also ready, you know. He was ready to do what God wanted him to do. The little boy was ready because he gave his food. Little is much when God's in it. Paul was not ashamed. What if the little boy had been ashamed to speak up and offer his food? This crowd wouldn't have been fed. What if you're ashamed? God might not be able to use you to feed someone else. As I began our invitation this morning, I want to share with you a story from President Carter. He talks about his interview with Admiral Rickover, Hyman Rickover. Hyman Rickover was what we would call the father of the nuclear navy. He was one of the most respected men in the Navy. He was active when I was on active duty in the Navy. And when you spoke that name, it was a name of great respect. We knew that he was a very intelligent man, and he demanded many things. And this is what President Carter says about that. He says, his interviews were legendary. Rickover always wanted to cut through the glib, rehearsed answers to get to look at the person underneath. And he especially wanted to know the candidates would act under, how they would act under stress. On occasion, he had them sit in a chair with the front legs sawed off an inch or two shorter than the back, just to throw them off balance. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that would be? You're sitting in a chair in front of the biggest admiral in the Navy, and you're scared to death because this is Admiral Rickover, you know. It's like going in the presence of God almost. And you're sitting in a chair that's tipped like that. That'd make you nervous. In his autobiography, Why Not the Best, President Carter tells about his Rickover interview. He said, the Admiral asked me how I stood in his class, how he stood in his class at the Naval Academy. I swelled my chest with pride and answered, sir, I stood 59th in a class of 820 people. I sat back to wait for the congratulations. Instead came the question, did you do your best? He said, I started to say, yes, sir, but I remembered who this was, and I gulped and admitted, no, sir, I didn't always do my best. And he looked at me for a long time, and then he asked one final question, which I've never been able to forget or to answer. And he said, why not? We're going to sit in that sloped seat one day before our Lord. And if he asked us the question, did you do the best you could do with what I gave you? What would our answer be? Most likely our answer would be kind of like Mr. Carter. Well, I didn't do my best. And he might ask us, why not? This morning, for we who are Christians, I want to challenge you. What's God calling you to do? I'm not talking about necessarily being a foreign missionary. I'm asking you what God is calling you to do. Something that might be on your mind, that God's been toying with you. I want you to do this. And our answer always will be, usually, I'm not equipped, I'm not ready, we got 1,000 excuses, I got to bury the dead or whatever, you know, all those excuses. And I ask you, will you be obedient so that he may be able to multiply in you his glory? And some of you have toyed with this for some time, and now God's saying, bring it to me. Give it to me. I want you. And I ask you today, Christian, will you be obedient to the voice of God? If you're a lost person here in this congregation this morning, God's saying to you, I'll take you just like you are. Lost people, we always feel like we've got to get our act cleaned up before we can come to the Lord. But he takes us just like we are because he knows us. He knows everything about us already. And he takes us just like we are. He will do the cleaning up. You won't have to worry about that. He says, I'll take your little and I'll make it much. I challenge you today to come and taste the goodness of the bread of life of Jesus Christ. Will you stand? If God's speaking to your heart today, right where you sit, Do business with God. He wants you in some capacity. Yield to that. He will give you what you need to get you where he wants you to be. And do the